In 2021, Lisa Harney weighed the flattened 22 slug to 36.8 grains. BCI Vault Glass, Trembling Desiccant, and Indigo Box 812214 hushed the rock salt myth. Fluorescent hum and rattling maples cradled the pellet's unyielding metal. If this whisper of Ohio history soothes you, please subscribe for more hushed midnights. Inside Bob's Carryout and Lounge on February 13, 1981, Gary Schwab polished thick mugs beneath a low amber Schlitz sign. His fingers traced decades of lacquer on the bar, while the jukebox sighed out the Statler Brothers over the soft hiss of the fryer. Mary Jane Ruther folded bar towels beside him, their cotton still damp from bleach, the cloth smelling faintly of lemons and old copper pipes. Robert Bob. Ruther stooped to refill the popcorn machine, salt crystals pattering like sleet into the metal scoop. Outside, a late winter wind combed the slush piles along Ohio Route 587, yet the linoleum floor kept a stored summer warmth from the basement furnace. She slid the ledger shut, feeling the raised grain of its cover like a favorite hymn book. Bob's brother had phoned earlier about a stray beagle, and Mary Jane's laugh had clung to the cigarette smoke drifting under the tin ceiling panels. Gary tested the lock on the back storage door, feeling its sticking hinge as the cash drawer chimed a closing note. Gary's breath fogged the back doorway when he peeked into the alley, checking that drifts had not buried the fire exit. A lone customer, Larry Boehm, nursed a cola and traced the condensation ring into a compass pointing home. The neon Budweiser horse flickered, casting red glows over stacked beer crates. For a final moment, the lounge breathed like a settled hearth, while the snow-suited night pressed its quiet muzzle against the glass. Bob's Carryout stood on the footprint of an 1876 general store that first traded lamp oil for rye flour when the B&O rail spur arrived. Carpenter Jacob Huth laid the original beechwood planks, and his granddaughter later recalled how wagon wheels grooved them to a satin sheen. In 1899, an assessor measured the storefront at 28 feet across and noted the scent of molasses barrels thickening in summer heat, a detail still penciled in the Seneca County ledger. Old receipts smelled of axle grease, evidence that farmers paid in both cash and mechanical favors. Trains screeched outside, flinging coal dust that darkened the clapboard until a 1912 repaint sealed the grain under red lead. When Prohibition sanded the town's nights to silence, the store's basement hid earthen crocks of brandy, their corks sweating nutmeg aromas through the floorboards. The community whispered about the building's luck, claiming a travelling preacher had blessed the lintels, yet receipts show the Rothers simply paid timely insurance premiums. By 1960, cinder block replaced timber, the walls holding residual tobacco sweetness even after fresh plaster dried. When a 1959 remodel replaced the foundation stones, workers found pickle barrels buried as insulation, their staves still perfumed with brine. Shelves once stacked with quilting thread shifted towards six-packs, but the counter retained its carved notch where Huth tallied harvest weights. Every renovation was a dialogue between memory and commerce, as if the brick skin knew each new owner would inherit both folklore and invoices. By 1944, the storefront to be served as an evening way station for scrap drives, with postmistress Alma Feldman tallying coffee tins and radiator fins beneath blackout shades that muted the kerosene glow. Letters from overseas crackled in her coat pocket, and she read them aloud to farmers while rain stippled the tin roof, the smell of paraffin mingling with damp wool. War Ration Book 4, stamped violet, rested on the counter beside crocks of chicory, promising sugar allotments to mothers who brought in bundles of rubber hose. Civil defense sirens moaned once a month, yet the lot stayed hushed, save for the rhythmic tapping of fountain pens recording pounds of copper, lard coupons, and the occasional jar of rosehip jam slipped into the pile for luck. Teen boys on bicycles coasted by with handlebars wrapped in blackout tape, listening for troop train whistles and the lower hum of night flying trainers circling southward. When the harvest moon lifted over the grain elevator, Alma would lock the ledger away, trace her finger across the old beach plank scar, and murmur that the building felt steadier now that sacrifice had seeped into its joints. Dawn brought the smell of cinnamon oatmeal from a nearby boarding house, and exhausted drivers slicked the lot a salute before steering toward the next convoy rendezvous, leaving the ground warm with tire heat and shared resolve. In the 1960s, when Interstate 75 siphoned traffic away, Bob Rother hung a new plywood sign that smelled of sap and enamel. Teenagers in varsity jackets leaned against the storefront, swapping quarters for Great Fago as the jukebox inside clicked between Connie Francis and Hank Thompson. Mary Jane recorded inventory in looping cursive, noting how cases of Stroh's gathered dust while chili spices sold faster whenever lake-effect snow wrapped the windows. Hunters returning from Seneca caverns stomped mud off their boots on the metal grate, the clang echoing into the stockroom where garlic bologna chilled. Teenagers scribbled initials into the picnic tables out back, the splinters catching in mittened thumbs. Bob added a second deadbolt in 1974 after hearing about Toledo robberies, testing its snick with calloused thumbs each closing time. Farmers tasted the fryer oil to judge freshness, claiming the peanuts stayed crisp longer because Mary Jane lined their bins with butcher paper dusted in salt. Bob kept a notebook of favourite regulars, annotating which pies they preferred, a kindness later treasured by families. Local historian Brent Lonsway later described the building as smelling of sweet diesel, because truckers left idling rigs outside while sipping late-night coffee. This coziness built faith that no harm would cross the threshold so long as regulars filled stools and hymns still rose from nearby St. Boniface. February 1981 dragged a brittle cold across Seneca County, with thermometer needles jittering at 9 degrees as dusk fell on the 13th. The National Weather Service log from Toledo recorded wind gusts scraping 21 miles per hour, bringing the scent of granular road salt into Bob's carryout each time the door opened. Salt trucks clattered along Route 587, their amber beacons strobing against the tavern windows like distant lighthouses. Farmhands paused for steaming beef sandwiches while their gloves dried on the radiator, the hiss sounding like subdued applause. Sheriff's Deputy Thomas Weaver cruised past at 10:48 p.m., noting in his patrol log that the neon signs glowed steady and the lot held 2 cars dusted in powdered snow. Mary Jane had swapped jukebox selections to softer ballads so late visitors would linger less, yet the machine's mechanical clack still punctured the hush. Gary methodically rinsed pint glasses in water warmed by a sputtering heater that filled the bar with a metallic tang. Inside, the faint scent of orange cleaner lingered from closing chores, blending with the yeast curl of fresh bread. Larry Boehm told friends he'd stop for a sandwich before heading to tiffin, the words scribbled on a napkin left at his mother's kitchen table. A church bulletin pinned near the register listed Lenten fish fries. Still, no one expected pennants to step through their own doorway. Outside, the town square's nativity scene, stored but not yet hauled away, leaned against the municipal garage like a reminder of quieter seasons. Robert Rother was 63, the smell of cherry pipe tobacco clinging to his wool blazer even after decades of tending bar. Born in 1917, he had apprenticed in Detroit auto plants before returning to New Regal to manage his father's grocery aisles. His ledgers showed tidy sums saved for the nieces he doted on, and his calligraphy spelled each supplier's name with respectful precision. Mary Jane, 56, once stitched vestments for Saint 4. Boniface, leaving gold thread shimmering in the choir loft whenever she unfurled new cloth. She preferred her coffee scalding with just enough sugar to taste like ash caramel. Her sewing machine, a 1950s Singer, rested in the stockroom office, its oil scent mingling with spice jars. Gary Schwab was 24, a Vietnam-era veteran never deployed, whose hands still bore faint calluses from rebuilding carriages in his parents' garage. He tuned the jukebox to Charlie Rich when the workday waned, claiming the crooner's voice matched the bar's amber lights. Gary kept a photograph of his black cat in his billfold, edges creased from repeated unfolding. Larry Boehm, 20, worked day shifts at a tiffin tool and dye shop and carried a harmonica scented with machine oil. He planned to trade overtime pay for a used Pontiac. Each person carried a keen sense of routine, the sort of predictability that lulled friends into believing the bar's locked doors spelled safety. Their mingled habits perfumed the lounge with roasted coffee, fresh starch, dial cleaner, and youth. All day on February 13, deliveries arrived in a quiet rhythm that later served as investigators' clockwork. At 9:15 a.m, the Schmidt baking driver signed the invoice with blue ink and left 4 trays of buns, noting frost feathering the stockroom window. Around noon, Mary Jane phoned the wholesale liquor rep in Findlay, her voice recorded on a microcassette archived in the company's files, requesting 2 cases of black velvet for Monday. Bob balanced bank deposits after lunch, the paper currency smelling of iron and fabric softener from pockets, then drove to Tiffin National Bank where cameras captured his heavy tweed coat at 1:70 am. Gary arrived at 3, whistling through chapped lips, and he fixed a cardboard shim under the cooler that rattled like loose cymbals. A Girl Scout troop stopped by selling cookies around 5, their wool hats shedding snowflakes that melted into sugary beads. Larry spent the evening at his friend Steve's garage, wiping his hands on gasoline-scented rags before aiming toward New Regal after 10:03 p.m. At 8:30 p.m, Bob phoned a wholesaler about a stubborn soda tap, the call logged with a faint smudge where his thumb held the receiver. Snowflakes sifted under the door by 11, sprinkling the rubber mats with icy grit. Mary Jane dialed her sister at 11:17 p.m, telling her the chili was gone and she'd close soon, a call documented by Ohio Bell toll records. Somewhere after midnight, the cash register tape tallied its final sale and jammed, the ribbon twisting like a halted heartbeat. At 1:05 a.m. on February 14, trucker Gerald Plott pulled into the gravel lot expecting fresh coffee, yet the front door stood unlatched. He smelled cold grease and silence, an absence louder than music, and saw lights still burning over the bar's mirrored wall. Plott called out, his voice echoing off the tin ceiling with no answer, then felt a draft slipping from the stockroom. The cash drawer lay open yet held folded singles, their edges unruffled, and the radio behind the bar whispered static. Following the draft, he found all 4 people bound in the storage area, wrists layered with brown electrical cord that bit into skin. 2 bodies slumped against crates of bottled pop, the labels glittering under fluorescent glare, while the other 2 lay on the concrete terrazzo floor near a toppled mop bucket. Plott staggered back onto the packed snow and dialed the sheriff from the payphone, the receiver smelling faintly of disinfectant and copper from his coins. Deputy Weaver arrived within minutes, trading glances with Plott before stepping inside, boots squeaking on linoleum. Weaver's heartbeat thudded in his ears, echoing the slow drip from a nearby defrosting freezer. He noted the faint smell of cordite clinging to the air despite the gaping door. Weaver's report noted the air tasted metallic, as if the heater vents exhaled pennies. He radioed for detectives, requesting the State Bureau of Criminal Identification and the coroner. Snowy air waited outside without judgment, carrying the scent of diesel through the open doorway. Sheriff's investigators sealed the scene by 2002 a.m., stretching yellow tape whose vinyl smell mingled with melting snow near the threshold. BCI agent John Lenhart arrived from Lima pursuing headlights that turned the dark 2-lane into a ribbon of white shards. Inside, he catalogued footprints in talcum-like dust on the stockroom floor, measuring heel widths at 3.5 inches and comparing them to the victim's shoes. Neighbor Charlotte Durnell stepped onto her porch, hearing the sirens slice the night while wood smoke perfumed her scarf. She later described the cruiser lights painting the snowbank cobalt, a hue that haunted her winters afterward. The coroner's thermometer recorded ambient temperature at 55 degrees due to the humming furnace, slowing cooling rates that would complicate the timeline. Officers collected a butter knife lying near the sink, its handle tacky with chili residue but no blood, while the coffee pot still radiated gentle heat. Wayne County Forensics vacuumed the carpet, capturing glittering slivers later determined to be shotgun wadding fragments. Detectives noticed no forced entry on either door. The main lock's strike plate bore fresh scratches, as if hurriedly opened from inside. Inventory sheets showed little missing beyond a few bottles of Canadian whiskey and perhaps 150 in rolled change, suggesting robbery was a pretext. Reporters from the Tiffin Advertiser-Tribune stood outside breathing steam and scribbling under sodium lamps. Lenhart whispered to Sheriff Al Grimm that the execution-style arrangement resembled organized crime cleanups, yet the victim's pockets still held cash meant for groceries. Dr. Robert Baker conducted autopsies on February 14 at the Seneca County morgue, the tiled room smelling of antiseptic phenol and wet linen. Scalpels gleamed under articulated lamps, their stainless steel warmed by the doctor's steady grip. He noted that Bob and Mary Jane each suffered a close-range shotgun blast to the chest, embedded pellets flattening against ribs like cold dewdrops. Gary and Larry bore gunshot wounds from a .22 caliber firearm, the entry holes clean and stippled with powder, suggesting the shooter stood within 3 feet. No defensive cuts marked their hands, only redness where cords abraded skin, implying they submitted under threat perhaps to shield one another. Toxicology screens later confirmed. None had alcohol levels above social sipping, undermining speculation of a barroom fight. The coroner numbered each pellet, placing them into labelled craft envelopes that retained a sweet paper smell, even after sealed with red evidence tape. Stainless basins caught rinse water, the splashes echoing like soft bells against the tiled walls. Time of death estimates coalesced around 1030 am, aligning with neighbours hearing a muffled thud they assumed was a dumpster lid. Mary Jane's rosary remained entwined in her fingers, beads warmed by body heat, a detail the coroner documented because family requested its return. Dr. Baker's report, stored on onion skin carbon paper, carried faint violet copies that BCI archivists still handle with cotton gloves to prevent smudging. Evidence technicians compiled itemized lists, including the lengths of electrical cords cutting precise segments of 32 and 34 inches. Each piece felt rigid with winter cold, and investigators bagged them with gloved care, noting faint traces of green paint consistent with household extension cords. Shotgun wadding bore the brand mark Federal, suggesting 12-gauge shells likely purchased within the local hardware circuit. Receipts from Bob's own shelves showed he stocked only 410 rounds, contradicting the My 410 rounds, contradicting the myth he kept a larger gauge for protection. Latent print powder clung to the glass cooler doors, like grey frost, yet revealed only smears, perhaps from gloved hands. The I-22 shell casings recovered near the mop bucket weighed 37.1 grains apiece when cleaned, matching the lab measurement that years later would reopen debate. Technicians also collected a faint shoe print lifted in gel, the residue smelling of winter salt and machine oil. Investigators also collected cigarette butts from the alley. Ash can, their filters tasting of peppermint when tested for trace additives, a brand favoured by an out-of-town salesman seen earlier that week. Ledger books taken as evidence bore oily fingerprints from decades of handling, but none matched parolees questioned in the following days. The security light outside flickered due to a loose ballast, casting stuttering shadows over the officers as they carried boxes to their cruisers. The Tiffin Advertiser-Tribune headlined the event as the Valentine's Day Massacre, in homage to Chicago law. Yet the article's body conveyed meticulous facts. Reporters described the crisp smell of pine cleaner lingering inside the tavern, and the snow-packed parking lot still showing tire ridges from patrons earlier that evening. During a news conference at the courthouse, Sheriff Grimm's voice rasped through microphones, its gravel softened by the marble rotunda's echo. He confirmed the autopsy findings, dismissed rumors of occult markings, and explained that the cash register tape was jammed rather than intentionally destroyed. Television crews from Toledo filmed the tavern's facade under midday sun, the camera lenses catching the red-white Schlitz sign creaking in a crosswind. A photographer developed prints in the courthouse darkroom, the chemical aroma of developer and fixer curling into the hallway. Local radio host Marla Quinn asked callers to remain calm, even as she described how the community tasted fear like iron in their drinking water. News coverage balanced shock with tenderness, sharing Mary Jane's recipe cards and Gary's volunteer work with the Lions Club pancake breakfast. Still, whispers about perceived mafia ties circulated, because years earlier a Toledo bookie had briefly rented a room above the original store. Investigators quietly cross-referenced mafia indices yet found no connective tissue, just the same recurring ache of senseless brutality. On February 16, a town hall convened inside St. Boniface's basement, an arched room smelling of waxed pews and simmering parish soup. Father Joseph Putz opened with a quiet prayer that settled like dust on winter coats, his cadence steady despite his reddened eyes. Sheriff Grimm followed, explaining investigative steps while steam from crockpots blurred the air around the podium. Citizens asked about patrol schedules, whether curfews might help, and how to support the victims' families without intruding. Retired teacher Nora Kessler described Larry's habit of sanding his harmonica case smooth during bingo nights, granting the room a tactile memory. Some residents wanted to form an informal watch, yet others feared provoking whoever committed the killings, a tension that tasted of stale coffee and patience. Children coloured sympathy cards at a corner table, crayons clicking softly while parents hushed them with gentle pats. Insurance agents advised business owners to review coverage, their pamphlets rustling like dried leaves. The meeting resolved into a rotation of meal deliveries for grieving relatives, and the basement gradually emptied, chairs scraping softly over linoleum squares. Outside, car doors thumped closed while snowflakes fluttered past the streetlight with moth-like insistence. Silence held the steeple, as if the bell might toll for answers, then released the gathering back into the cold night. Tips streamed into the sheriff's office throughout February, the lobby perfumed by wet wool coats and photocopier toner. One caller claimed to have seen a tan Buick idling near the tavern around midnight, its exhaust plumes glowing under the sodium lamp. Detectives jotted the license digits on paper that later smudged in their files. In the evidence room, cassette tapes clicked as interviews rewound, the magnetic tape releasing a faint plastic tang. Another insisted the murders mirrored a 1978 Michigan spree, yet the ballistic signatures offered no match. Agents interviewed parolees in Marion and Mansfield, sliding crime scene photos across metal tables that smelled of disinfectant and stale cigarettes. They also questioned travelling salesmen whose route logs placed them within 30 miles, listening for inconsistencies while sipping burnt percolator coffee. Gary's friends recalled a man with a raspy laugh playing pool earlier that week, but their memories dissolved into the clatter of cue balls and jukebox chords. Investigators canvassed hardware stores for recent purchases of federal 12-gauge shells. Clerks remembered frostbitten fingers fumbling for change, nothing more. Local hunters volunteered to lead officers through wooded gullies where a weapon might be discarded, crunching through crusted snow while crows heckled from maples. Yet no firearm surfaced, and the cold seeped deeper into the case files stacked like layered shingles. The investigation's rhythm felt methodical, proving diligence could persist even when leads evaporated. Fear settled over New Regal, not as hysteria, but as a series of decisions to speak lightly, to let uncertain memories fade. Bartenders in nearby towns stopped gossiping about high-stakes card games, because rumour alone felt like bait for unseen violence. Farm supply clerks whispered that talking too much might scare customers away, and economic silence layered atop fear. Families kept porch lights burning until dawn, their bulbs filling night air with a faint ozone scent. Reporters returned to Toledo, and the town's quiet turned into a blanket of respect, yet also a shield for secrets people worried might implicate friends. A truck mechanic told investigators he had repaired a stranger's Chevy the week before, but later recanted, perhaps wary of retaliation or of being wrong. Church bulletins printed the victims' names each Sunday through Lent, candle wax dripping onto the pages like slow tears. Farmers remarked that coyotes howled more boldly after the killings, their voices carrying across frozen fields, and some neighbours refused to mention the bar at all. This collective hush was not imposed by authorities. It arose from a desire to keep grief from spiralling into vigilantism. The result, however, was a dampening of potential leads, a suppression born from protective love. People inhaled the scent of wood smoke and made promises to wait, to heal, to remember quietly. In early 1982, BCI analysts revisited the evidence, unsealing envelopes that released whispers of paper fibre into the lab's filtered air. The reopened envelopes emitted a stale breath of fryer smoke trapped for decades, startling the analysts with its persistence. They compared the 22 ballistics to national databases via teletype, the machine's clattering rhythm echoing through the sterile room. No match surfaced, yet the process left carbon copies folded into case files like thin, crinkled snow. Investigators also re-examined the electrical cords, tracing their manufacturer to an Ohio company that sold through hardware chains across the Midwest, offering little specificity. The cord's copper strands glinted under magnification, each hair-like filament reflecting the lab lights. Agents re-interviewed acquaintances of a Toledo drifter rumored to carry both weapons, but this lead dissolved when employment records showed him in Kentucky that week. A psychic from Cleveland mailed a letter perfumed with lavender oil, claiming the murderer wore a ring engraved with a hawk. Detectives filed it politely without comment. Meanwhile, the bar's new owners repainted the cinder-block walls, sealing in the lingering smell of fryer grease while leaving the stockroom locked, out of reverence and unease. Suppression took bureaucratic form when budget cuts limited overtime, forcing investigators to stack notes for later review. By 1983, Seneca County commissioners documented the investigation costs at $72,400, a figure scribbled on ledger paper scented faintly of carbon ink. Deputies logged overtime hours by hand, their pens scratching like insects across ledger columns. Grants funded additional forensic photography, so technicians reshot the crime scene evidence using Kodachrome slides that rendered bloodstains in deep russet. The slides clicked into carousel projectors during weekly briefings, casting the bar's narrow hallway onto walls while detectives sipped vending machine cocoa. Prosecutors considered convening a grand jury, but lacked witnesses willing to testify beyond rumor, a hesitation born of both fear and exhaustion. Meanwhile, Mary Jane's sister curated a scrapbook of sympathy cards, their edges brushed with pressed violets that smelled of earth even after drying. Family members visited the bar's shuttered doorway on anniversaries, leaving chrysanthemums that rustled in the wind like tissue paper. Some locals suggested the town should raze the building, yet others argued for preservation, believing history, even the painful kind, deserved a physical anchor. The debate reflected a balancing act between wanting closure and refusing to erase the stage on which the tragedy occurred. Businesses around the square experienced a quiet downturn, the absence of evening laughter noticeable as a hollow in the soundscape. The case persisted in files and in heartbeats, still awaiting a decisive thread. In 1984, Seneca County welcomed a new sheriff, Charles D. Ely, who inherited binders thick with transcripts and Polaroids that crackled when flipped. He ordered an audit of evidence storage, ensuring each bag retained its chain of custody signatures and remained unsullied by time. Ely's deputies practiced room entry drills in the armory, boots thudding over concrete, the air thick with gun oil and determination. State labs had begun experimenting with trace metal detection swabs, so technicians tested the victim's hands for firearm residue, though results remained inconclusive due to the shotgun's overwhelming spray. Ely met with the Rother and Boehm families in a courthouse conference room smelling of lemon polish, promising persistence without false hope. Insurance companies settled claims for the destroyed business, yet a clause about criminal acts required painstaking documentation of losses, prolonging paperwork like a second morning. Meanwhile, a travelling carnival set up near Fostoria, and townspeople noted how its calliope music felt jarring against their tempered evenings. Investigators circled back to the tan Buick sighting, canvassing auto shops for similar vehicles needing repair after the cold night. Mechanics recalled frozen carburetors and cracked hoses, but no suspicious replacements. Rain beaded on the courthouse windows, whispering patient syllables against the glass, while deputies listened and let the files breathe. Long before electricity hummed through the bar, the land hosted Wyandotte hunters who carved trails still echoed in 19th century survey notes. An 1821 land patent recorded the soil as rich loam streaked with clay, ideal for corn that would later fund the town's modest prosperity. Wind carried the scent of wild mint along Honey Creek, a fragrance early settlers recorded with grateful surprise. Early settler diaries mention night fires along Honey Creek, sparks leaping like spirits yet simply signaling late harvest vigils. When the Ohio Canal project bypassed the area, New Regal compensated by polishing its hospitality, offering clean beds and steaming stews to travelers jolted by plank roads. The general store that preceded Bob's carried scented soap from Cincinnati, its lavender fragrance lingering in the ledger margins now stored at the Seneca County Museum. These archival traces reveal Discovery's first chapter. People recognized the land's capacity to host warmth against winter's bite. Suppression entered when ticket agents later promoted larger towns, shrinking New Regal's presence on train schedules and encouraging locals to keep to themselves. Rediscovery bloomed in the 1960s when vintage postcards celebrated the village's German Catholic festivals, their glossy ink proclaiming a pride that reawakened after decades of quiet. Architectural surveys from 1948 described the bar's predecessor as a two-story masonry veneer with moderate craftsmanship, yet the inspector's notes dwelled on the scent of cinnamon rolls drifting from the attached bakery. That year, veterans returned from war and brought jute boxes to small towns, allowing fresh vinyl crackles to mingle with the hiss of percolated coffee. Mary Jane, then newly married, stitched blackout curtains into cheerful drapes, letting morning sun dapple the bar with patterns reminiscent of lace. Discovery manifested when she found an old prayer card wedged behind the wainscoting, its edges gilded and its surface smelling faintly of frankincense. She framed it near the register, believing it would watch over their evenings. Suppression emerged in 1955 when a storm shattered the transom window, and she covered the damage with plain plywood until insurance cleared repairs, muting light and muffling laughter. Children pressed their noses to the new plate glass, watching snowflakes liquefy into rivulets while warmth fogged the interior. Rediscovery followed when Bob installed plate glass a year later, the pane shining like still water and pairing the street's reflections with the bar's amber glow. That cycle, discover, conceal, reveal, became the building's heartbeat, preparing the stage for the night when darkness turned predatory. In 1990, Sheriff's Detective Larry Mack reopened the case with fresh eyes, his desk lit by a banker's lamp emitting a comforting green sheen. He reorganized witness statements chronologically and stored them in acid-free boxes that smelled faintly of starch, protecting the paper from yellowing. He also retyped transcripts on modern paper, the clatter of keys soothing his thoughts as midnight edged closer. Mack interviewed trucker Gerald Plott again, this time in a quieter office where the hum of the vending machine formed a steady undertone. Plott remembered feeling grit on the hallway floor, perhaps from salt clinging to the killer's boots, a detail Mack dutifully logged. The detective also reached out to the newly formed Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, entering the case data into computers that chirped with dot matrix printers. He received profiles suggesting the killer might have blended familiarity with opportunism, someone comfortable moving in small-town spaces. Mack's notes mention the scent of cigar smoke wafting from the sheriff's private office, where strategies were debated late into the night. Family members visited to offer additional photographs, their glossy surfaces squeaking as Mack slid them into protective sleeves. The renewed effort represented rediscovery, propelling the case back into regional news segments and stirring dormant memories. Yet budget deadlines curtailed travel to follow leads out of state, evidence of practical suppression reasserting itself. 2 years later, in 1992, forensic scientists revisited the ammunition evidence, employing comparative microscopy that produced images resembling luminous lunar landscapes. The lab smelled of coolant and graphite as technicians aligned the Otter 22 casings under dual eyepieces, tracing microscopic striations that could link to a specific firearm. They photographed each casing with scales, ensuring measurements down to 0.01 millimeters were preserved in the record. Meanwhile, detectives drove to Detroit to interview former associates of a suspect rumored to have fled there, the city's diesel tang seeping into their wool coats. On the drive back, detectives ate diner pie slick with strawberry glaze, the sweetness grounding them after fruitless interviews. Their motel notes reveal the walls vibrated with jazz from a nearby lounge, a sensory detail that underscored their distance from rural quiet. The interviews faltered, alibis checked out, and the suspects' fingerprints failed to match latent lifts from the crime scene. Back home, the tavern underwent renovations under new ownership, with workers sanding the bar top until raw maple released a sweet, sawdust aroma. They discovered an old buffalo nickel wedged in a floorboard, a small recovery bridging past prosperity with present grief. Yet they walled off the stockroom from public view, a physical manifestation of reverent suppression born from respect for those lost. In 1994, an anonymous letter arrived at the sheriff's office, the envelope smudged with what appeared to be fireplace soot. Inside, block-printed sentences accused a long-haul driver of confessing during a drunken stopover in Indiana, promising more details if authorities read the clue between rail timetables. Detectives pursued the lead, examining station logs and interviewing rail employees whose hands smelled of grease and steel filings. The alleged confession evaporated under scrutiny. No witness corroborated the story, and the supposed driver had died 2 years prior. Still, the letter's texture rough paper, slightly perfumed with stale smoke, lingers in the file as a reminder of community desperation. A volunteer choir sang softly near the memorial booth, their harmonies weaving through the crisp air like scarf tassels. Investigators used the opportunity to revisit neighboring counties, asking if similar crimes occurred, and found none. During that year's Heritage Festival, a memorial booth displayed the victims' photos beside candles flickering with beeswax scent, reminding visitors that the case remained open. Volunteers collected oral histories, capturing stories about the bar's camaraderie, the taste of its chili, the way Mary Jane hummed hymns while slicing lemons. The festival's brass band played softly, notes floating over cornstalks and carnival rides. Lanterns swayed above the square, murmuring with the wind and promising that light could persist. In 1999, Ohio's legislature expanded DNA collection laws, prompting BCI to re-inventory cold cases for biological traces once deemed unusable. Analysts reopened the new Regal boxes inside a temperature-controlled lab that smelled faintly of ethanol and photocopier ozone. Swabs taken from the shotgun wadding produced limited cellular material, yet improved extraction methods coaxed faint profiles, though not enough for definitive matches. Scientists archived leftover extracts in microtubes labeled with tiny barcodes, the freezer's frost biting their fingertips through latex. Technicians described the sensation of lifting evidence tape softened by age, its adhesive tugging like dried sap from envelopes. Detectives cross-checked the partial profiles against the combined DNA index system, newly available to county agencies, but the system returned no hits. Still, the effort marked discovery of future possibilities, as the case now held genetic breadcrumbs. The sheriff's office launched community outreach, inviting residents to submit tips via prepaid postcards printed on textured cardstock smelling of printer's ink. Some responses recounted dreams of the victims requesting patience. Others described suspicious strangers remembered only by the squeak of leather jackets. The accumulation of hopes and facts filled file cabinets whose drawers clanged like church bells whenever opened. Each incremental advance suggested the case would not simply fade into folklore, but remain anchored in evolving science. By 2001, technological optimism surged, and investigators collaborated with psychologists to construct behavioral profiles grounded in routine rather than sensationalism. Meetings took place in conference rooms bathed in fluorescent light, the air tinged with brewed tea and new binders. The profile suggested the killer likely wore winter gloves, explaining the absence of clear fingerprints yet leaving minute fiber traces that unfortunately had degraded. Detectives revisited the electrical cords, tracking retail batches through manufacturing lot numbers. They learned one spool sold in Fostoria days before the crime, though cash sales left no customer names. Retail clerks remembered the cord's rubbery scent, but not the buyer's face. They also consulted meteorological records to understand how the cold might have altered scent trails, even though crime dogs were never deployed. At community forums, residents discussed how grief had altered their sense of night sounds, owls no longer soothing but startling. Survivors' relatives described the way grief tasted like oversteeped coffee, and how they folded that bitterness into perseverance. The case remained both personal and public, blending the sterile glow of evidence labs with the hearth warmth of shared memories. Investigators knew each retelling risked myth-making, so they grounded discussions in documented timestamps, signed statements, and the measured lengths of cord. In 2002, the Ohio Attorney General's office assigned veteran investigator Philip Recker to review the case, bringing fresh handwriting analysis expertise. Recker laid suspect signatures side by side under magnification, the ink lines revealing tremors, hesitations, and loops scented faintly of the archive's musty boxes. He interviewed former employees of the tavern, asking about backdoor habits, the squeak of hinges, the tick of the kitchen clock, details that might spotlight who felt comfortable moving unseen. One witness recalled hearing a muffled pop that night while holding a cup of cocoa near the window. Her description of the cocoa's nutmeg fragrance anchored the memory. He noted a faint squeak when the laser measured the doorframe, indicating a warp that could have nudged it ajar during the attack. Recker also traced the Canadian whiskey distribution chain, verifying that only 2 local establishments stocked the missing brand, yet both accounted for inventory. He concluded the theft served merely to stage a robbery narrative. The bar's new proprietors allowed investigators to map the building with laser rangefinders, their red beams flickering over walls still imbued with faint scents of aged beer. The resulting diagrams resembled a blueprint of absence, capturing angles and distances that would feed future reconstructions. In 2006, genealogist Dr. Elaine Huber volunteered to assist, intrigued by the convergence of family law and unresolved violence. She cross-referenced census records with bar patron lists, seeking patterns in surnames that frequently appeared during winter months. Her office smelled of archival paste and pencil shavings as she traced family trees branching through Seneca, Hancock, and Wyandotte counties. Huber noted that several patrons shared distant kinship, weaving a community tapestry tight with obligations. Huber traced baptismal records scented faintly of incense, their vellum pages ruffling whenever courthouse vents kicked on. She theorized the killer might have exploited this closeness, entering through trust rather than force. Her research unearthed an 1887 diary entry describing a night watch tradition where villagers took turns guarding storehouses during harvest. The practice had faded, leaving nights unguarded beyond faith in locks. Huber presented her findings at a historical society meeting lit by tapers and warmed by cinnamon cider. While the genealogy didn't name a suspect, it reaffirmed that the bar stood at the nexus of generational bonds. Investigators adopted her insights, considering not only outsiders but insiders who could navigate kin expectations. In 2008, a memorial mural was painted on a neighbouring wall, the artists mixing pigments outdoors despite crisp March winds that reddened their cheeks. They depicted 4 lanterns floating above a silhouette of the tavern, each flame brushed with gold leaf that glimmered under street lamps. Children pressed gloved hands against the wall, leaving fog halos that dissipated slowly like whispers. The mural's protective sealant smelled of citrus solvent, and viewers reported feeling warmth radiating from the brick despite the cold. During its dedication, chimes fashioned from empty bottles tinkled, the glass catching echoes of the names read aloud. Investigators set up a booth nearby displaying 3D renderings of the crime scene generated on newly acquired software, inviting citizens to walk through digitally. The renderings recreated the hum of the refrigerator, the glint of the neon clock, even the faint drip from a mop wringer. People who had avoided the topic for decades found themselves speaking in hushed voices, sharing recollections about who habitually sat where. Some visitors tasted tears, salty and unexpected, as they touched the painted lanterns. Evening shadows stretched while the mural cured, promising to guard memory with colour. Briars rustled, breath slowed, and the mural's glow lingered in the cooling twilight, holding space for whispered vows. In 2011, Attorney General Mike DeWine announced a statewide cold case initiative, and the new Regal murders occupied a prominent file on the intake table. Investigators transported the evidence to the remodeled BCI lab in London, where the air smelled of fresh paint and ionized filters. They digitized every photograph, allowing analysts to zoom into textures once visible only with magnifying lenses. A new technique called touch DNA promised to lift skin cells from the electrical cords, so technicians in powder blue gowns gently swabbed the fibers while a centrifuge whirred like subdued thunder. Technicians loved even the hum of the centrifuge, ensuring their notes captured the environment as completely as the samples. The resulting profiles remained partial, yet they hinted at two contributors beyond the victims, rekindling hope. Detectives revisited interviewees, now older, asking them to walk through their memories while inhaling the comforting aroma of brewed chamomile tea provided for the sessions. Some recalled the crunch of snow under unfamiliar boots. Others focused on the peculiar silence that followed the gunshots. The state also offered reward enhancements, printing posters that glowed orange under streetlights. The renewed spotlight nudged the case from the shadows again, bridging past and present through digital clarity. In 2013, forensic artist Samantha Molnar reconstructed the crime scene in charcoal sketches, layering the shading to emulate the stockroom's fluorescent glare. Her studio smelled of graphite and linseed oil, and she played vinyl recordings of rustling leaves to maintain a meditative pace. Each sketch captured the sheen of the concrete, the frayed edges of electrical cords, the sheen of tears on a patron's imagined face. The drawings were displayed at the county fair, tucked beside historical quilts, allowing viewers to confront the tragedy in a contemplative setting. Visitors noted that the charcoal dust left their fingertips dark, a physical reminder of touching history. Nearby, a display case held the original register keys, their metal cool to the touch, bridging tactile memory with visual storytelling. Molnar included annotations about light sources and shadows, demonstrating how the killer could navigate without stumbling, suggesting familiarity with the layout. The exhibit invited reflection without spectacle, letting visitors feel the chill that had once permeated the stockroom while acknowledging the lingering warmth of community solidarity. In 2016, advanced ballistic software became available, enabling analysts to create three-dimensional models of pellet trajectories. The lab resembled a minimalist gallery, walls painted dove grey, with computers humming softly like distant cicadas. Analysts input measurements from 1981 angles, wound paths, pellet dispersal, reconstructing the moment each shot rang. They charted the furnace cycles, recognizing how its roar could have blanketed subtle noises during the critical minutes. The simulations revealed the shooter likely stood near the mop sink when firing the .22, aligning with footprints previously overlooked because they overlapped in dusty smears. Detectives revisited the scene with laser pointers, their red beams slicing through faint scents of sanitizer from the renovated kitchen. They realized the killer must have stepped onto a rubber mat that would have squeaked softly, perhaps covered by the roar of the furnace. Revisiting physical space offered fresh appreciation for how skilled the assailant was at minimizing noise. The study reinforced that bravery alone wouldn't solve the case. Only relentless attention to physical fact could pierce the myth's hushed fabric. In 2018, the success of genealogical DNA in other cold cases inspired Seneca County to seek familial searching approval. The process required legal briefs drafted in conference rooms scented with toner and brewed espresso. Judges granted permission, and genetic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick joined the team, receiving the partial profiles extracted from the electrical cords. She compared them against public genealogy databases, mapping potential relatives across branches that smelled metaphorically of Cedar Hope. Fitzpatrick mapped ancestral migrations with pins on a corkboard, the pattern resembling constellations glowing under the office lamp. Matches were distant, third and fourth cousins scattered through Indiana, Michigan, and Ontario. Fitzpatrick held community meetings explaining how the technique worked, using slides that projected gentle tones of green and blue. Attendees heard about centimorgans, recombination, and statistical likelihoods while sipping apple cider. The genealogical tree narrowed to a family line with Ohio roots and a history of traveling sales. investigators sought interviews, approaching relatives with compassion, offering lavender-scented tissues as conversations reopened old family rifts. Though no arrest followed, rediscovery felt tangible. Science had provided a path previously uncharted, reminding everyone that time can fold back on itself, revealing hidden branches. In 2009, the Sheriff's Office hosted a remembrance walk that traced the quarter-mile from St. Boniface to the former tavern site. Participants carried lanterns lit with battery candles, their glow reflecting off freshly fallen snow that dampened footsteps into muffled thuds. The procession smelled of wool scarves, beeswax polish from the church doors, and faint diesel from the escorting patrol car. Along the route, storytellers paused to share archival snippets, a clerk's memo about stock deliveries, a customer's postcard describing the bar's chili as peppery comfort on a slate sky. Local bakers donated loaves of warm bread afterward, the crust crackling as participants broke pieces to share quietly. At the site, musicians played a slow fiddle air that hung in the cold like silver thread. Investigators set up a table with new tip forms, the paper thick and soft, encouraging people to write while memories stirred. One attendee recalled seeing a man wipe his boots on the rear mat days before the incident, a detail newly noted. The gathering ended with a shared silence, faces uplifted toward the night sky speckled with faint stars. Frost clasped the lantern glass as the crowd dispersed, promising to hold the light longer than the night could extinguish. In 2020, pandemic shutdowns altered investigative rhythms, yet detectives worked remotely, poring over scanned documents while home offices smelled of brewed coffee and printer ink. Some investigators found comfort in the faint scent of sourdough starters fermenting in their kitchens as they studied files late into the night. Virtual meetings connected them with forensic experts, the digital interface replacing the shared hum of conference rooms with the faint buzz of headphones. Analysts revisited call logs, overlaying them on cell tower maps to visualize timelines with renewed clarity. They discovered a gap between 12,000 and 130A, a window where no outgoing calls occurred despite the bar typically checking in with taxi services. This absence suggested the killer may have disconnected the phone momentarily, a subtle act aligning with meticulous planning. Family members joined video conferences, their faces lit by screen glow, recounting how grief intertwined with the isolating quiet of quarantine. The case, though paused in physical movement, remained active in minds, its evidence now stored in secure cloud servers humming silently beyond human senses. Suppression in the form of public lockdowns ironically allowed investigators to rediscover overlooked digital patterns. By 2021, Lisa Harney's measurement of the 22 slug, captured in the opening of this narrative, catalyzed a re-evaluation of ballistic interpretations. She double-checked the grain weight against fresh calibration standards scented with machine oil and ozone. The heavier-than-expected deformation implied the bullet struck shelving before lodging in Mary Jane's shoulder, altering assumptions about shooter positioning. Investigators returned to the now-closed bar, permitted access by the current owners who had transformed it into storage. Dust motes shimmered as flashlights swept across old shelving, revealing faint gouges at height consistent with the revised trajectory. Harney inhaled the smell of aged cardboard and concluded the killer likely aimed hastily, contradicting theories of cold precision. Yet the choice to bind victims first still reflected chilling control. Harney pinned a photocopy of the revised trajectory beside the original, the two diagrams whispering of progress when aligned. The team compiled their findings into a report printed on thick ivory paper, its texture reminiscent of archival documents from 1880. They shared results with families, whose tears mingled with lavender sachets. Mary Jane's sister carried as comfort. The measurement, a small number etched into evidence logs, rebalanced narrative against myth. It reminded everyone that data quiet, persistent, could erode even the most dramatic legends whispered over decades. In 2022, advancements in footwear impression analysis emerged, allowing technicians to revisit the partial prints preserved in plaster casts since 1981. The lab smelled of damp gypsum as the casts were moistened and scanned with structured light. Software generated high-resolution models showing a herringbone tread pattern likely from a work boot popular in Midwestern hardware stores during the late 1970s. The cedar chest lid creaked like an old hymn book, releasing a puff of dust that glittered in flashlight beams. Investigators matched the pattern to purchase records from a Fostoria farm supply, narrowing the list of potential buyers by cross-referencing loyalty stamp books smelling of glue and dust. One name overlapped with the family line identified through genealogical DNA, intensifying scrutiny. Detectives scheduled interviews, bringing along coffee in thermoses and stacks of old photographs. The suspect's relatives described a man who favoured peppermint cigarettes, echoing the ashcan evidence from 1981. Though he had passed away, his belongings kept in a cedar chest offered possible trace evidence. The chest emitted a blend of cedar, leather and nostalgia as it opened, revealing a worn coat with fibre patterns similar to those recovered from the scene. Samples were collected, packaged and logged with fresh signatures, ensuring the chain of custody remained unbroken even after 4 decades. In 2023, the cedar chest fibres underwent analysis with Raman spectroscopy, a technique that translated light into spectral fingerprints. The lab lights dimmed as lasers traced the fibres, their glow reflecting off stainless steel countertops. Results showed a unique blend of cotton and acrylic, consistent with a limited-run jacket sold through a Toledo catalogue in 1980. Investigators contacted surviving catalogue employees, who described the jacket's texture as slick like rain, slicker yet lined with fleece. One recalled the smell of the warehouse where the jackets were stored, motor oil mingled with cardboard and peppermint from seasonal candy. The catalogue's order forms, preserved on microfilm, yielded mailing addresses, including one leading to a farmhouse outside Fostoria now owned by distant cousins. Excavation of the farmhouse's shed revealed rusted nails, an old shotgun cleaning kit, and a partial box of federal 12-gauge shells. Detectives felt a chill when the shells clinked in evidence trays, the metallic ring echoing across decades. The shells' lot numbers matched those sold in the region weeks before the murders. Each discovery layered fact upon fact, the vibrations of truth humming through machines older than some investigators now on the case. In 2024, Seneca County announced that evidence would be presented to a grand jury once additional DNA analysis concluded, a cautious yet hopeful disclosure. Prosecutor Derek Devine spoke in the courthouse atrium, the air carrying aromas of polished marble and spring rain tracked in on jurors' shoes. A light rain tapped the atrium skylight during the announcement, the rhythm steadying anxious hearts. He emphasized that patience remained essential, that the measured approach honored both victims and the integrity of the process. Families sat nearby, fingers entwined, listening to the gentle echo of their own breathing beneath the atrium's dome. Investigators continued rechecking files, letting the soft scratch of pen on paper anchor them to deliberate method. Community members left chrysanthemums on the tavern's doorstep again, petals damp with dew. News outlets covered the announcement with subdued tones, narrating years of persistence rather than sensationalism. Evening settled over New Regal as porch lights flickered on in quiet solidarity. Cicadas murmured, rain perfumed the sidewalks, and the courthouse clock exhaled solemn chimes into the mist-washed night. The legend of the night siege once painted the killer as a vengeful drifter wielding rock salt, sparing lives while delivering a warning. That myth smelled of campfire smoke and adrenaline, passed between teenagers on summer nights when cornfields rustled. Facts, however, settled like archival dust, steady and inescapable. Each measured cord length, every pellet weight, each notarized statement replaced embellished whispers with tactile truth. The Wade slug became a kind of prayer bead, invoked whenever conversations risked drifting toward theatrics. The community learned to let the myth coexist only as a reminder of how fear seeks dramatic costume. Reflection became an act of gentle excavation, uncovering the ordinary humanity of those lost, the humming friars, the soft laughter over card games. In quiet conversations at the Historical Society, volunteers compared the myth to the documented evidence, tracing how stories mutate when official silence, born of respect and investigation, leaves room for imagination. They reframed the legend, seeing not supernatural siege but a targeted crime anchored in human choices. The air in those meetings held the scent of archival paper and cinnamon cookies, comfort layering over hard edges. Myth no longer dominated. Measurement did, steady as the courthouse clock. Archaeologists from Heidelberg University conducted a small dig in 2024 behind the tavern site, hoping to uncover remnants from the 19th century general store. The soil smelled of damp clay and decomposed leaves as they trailed carefully, listening to cicadas drone. They unearthed shards of cobalt stoneware, iron nails, and a clay marble, items that once cluttered the pockets of children who lingered after errands. Among the finds lay a corroded door hinge, perhaps from the earliest incarnation of the building. The hinge's weight echoed the metaphorical hinges upon which the town's history swung, moments when discovery opened possibilities, when suppression closed doors, when rediscovery nudged them ajar again. Archaeologists recorded each find with total stations, their laser chirps harmonizing with distant church bells. Community volunteers rinsed artifacts in buckets, the water turning silty brown, smelling faintly of mineral springs. Children visiting the dig wrinkled their noses at the earthy scent, yet they leaned in, eyes reflecting curiosity and empathy. These physical remnants reminded residents that the land had been a site of trade, laughter, and ordinary life long before tragedy darkened it. The excavation, though not tied directly to the murders, offered tactile reassurance that history includes resilience alongside sorrow. Larry Boehm's niece, Emma, now a librarian, began hosting oral history nights at the public library in Tiffin. She arranged chairs in a semicircle beneath pendant lights, the air carrying the papery scent of aged hardcovers. Attendees were invited to bring objects connected to the bar, a cocktail stirrer, a faded receipt, a matchbook smelling faintly of sulphur. Emma read from Larry's letters describing his harmonica practice, the parchment silky from years of handling. Participants shared memories of Mary Jane's gentle jokes, Bob's precise change-making, Gary's eagerness to volunteer for charity raffles. Emma emphasized the importance of documenting the mundane details, the sound of the doorbell announcing customers, the taste of the bar's dill pickles, so future generations would know the victims beyond their final night. Recording equipment captured the softness of voices, the occasional sniffle, the rustle of sweaters. Emma stored the recordings on archival drives, labeling each with lavender stickers her aunt once used for recipe cards. The project functioned as rediscovery, granting the community agency to define the narrative. Emma avoided speculation about suspects, focusing on preserving personhood with respect. The library's quiet hum, punctuated by the occasional beep of a scanning barcode, underscored the gentle persistence of memory. Architectural historian David Myers conducted a structural study, mapping how sound traveled through the tavern's cinderblock walls. He used acoustic modeling software to simulate the shotgun blasts, the 922 pops, and even normal conversation, translating them into waveforms that rippled across digital diagrams. He even simulated the soft clink of ice in glasses, demonstrating how ordinary bar noise could mask approaching footsteps. The models revealed that the stockroom absorbed sound more than expected, meaning nearby residents might genuinely have missed the violence despite being awake. Myers presented his findings in a lecture hall smelling of dry erase markers and coffee. He explained how the ceiling tiles, installed in 1978, contained fiberglass insulation that muffled high frequencies. This data countered rumors that the town ignored obvious cries for help, easing a burden carried by some neighbors for decades. He paired the science with empathy, describing how architecture can inadvertently shield both comfort and crime. The presentation concluded with a live demonstration, a soft chime rung near the stage, barely audible at the back row, proving the building's design played a role in the night's perceived silence. Listeners left with a nuanced understanding that physical space shapes memory. Acoustic Insight inspired musician Jonah Renner to compose a soundscape honoring the night siege victims, layering field recordings from New Regal streets. He captured the purr of distant tractors, the creak of shop doors, the murmur of Honey Creek at dusk, mixing them with gentle harmonium drones. Renner layered a distant church bell into the mix, its tone soft as fog and resonant as polished brass. The composition included the faint clink of glassware and the low thump of a jukebox bass line, evoking the bar's ambience without reenacting violence. Renner premiered the piece in the town square under strings of Edison bulbs that perfumed the air with warm filament heat. Attendees wrapped themselves in blankets, sipping cocoa that tasted of nutmeg and hope. The soundscape invited listeners to breathe deeply, to absorb the ordinary textures of a night before tragedy struck. As the final tones faded, only the whisper of wind through maple leaves remained, carrying the weight of absence with grace. Maple leaves whispered, breath slowed, and the night held every echo with tender patience around the listening crowd. Legal scholars from Ohio Northern University dissected the case during a seminar on cold case prosecutions. They analyzed statutes of limitations, none applicable to murder, and discussed evidentiary hurdles when witnesses age. The classroom smelled of chalk dust and new casebooks, the air buzzing with eager questions. Professor Alana Burke highlighted how prosecutorial discretion balances evidence sufficiency against the risk of acquittal, noting that silence sometimes stems from caution rather than neglect. Students debated ethical considerations. Should authorities reveal every lead publicly, or could that compromise future testimony? They examined the night siege file's redactions, understanding that withholding certain details preserved the ability to confirm confessions later. The seminar emphasized that the justice system's measured pace, though frustrating, prevented miscarriages of justice. The students later visited the courthouse, inhaling the blend of old books and polished banisters as theory met marble reality. Attendees left with notebooks smudged in graphite, their pages filled with citations and reflections on duty. The legal discourse added another layer of discovery, showing how law itself evolves to shepherd old cases toward resolution. Journalist Renee Harper produced a long-form podcast in 2025, recording episodes in a studio scented with warm electronics and foam panels. She interviewed investigators, family members, historians, and scientists, weaving their voices into a narrative that favored empathy over sensationalism. She edited late into the night, the studio monitors casting turquoise light while crickets chirped outside the open window. Harper described the tavern's interior using ambient sounds, the hum of a cooler, the soft clang of a swinging door, the snow-muffled quiet outside. She interspersed archival clips of radio reports, crackly yet poignant, reminding listeners how the case unfolded in real time. Throughout, she returned to the image of the Wade slug, the precise 36.8 grains that punctured legend. Her closing episodes pondered why communities cling to myths, how silence can be both shield and shroud. Listeners sent messages describing how the podcast lulled them to sleep while also educating them, fulfilling the ASMR cadence the channel cherished. Harper concluded by encouraging continued attention rather than demanding action, aligning with the community's gentle resolve. The evidence itself resides in climate-controlled cabinets where silica gel packs smell faintly of clay each time boxes are unsealed. Custodian Maria Ortiz performs quarterly checks, running gloved fingers along seals, ensuring no adhesive fails. She records humidity levels, listening to the steady hum of the system maintaining 45% relative humidity. Ideal for paper, less inviting for mold. She likened the cabinet's hum to a lullaby, one that lulled evidence into guarded sleep rather than forgetfulness. Ortiz speaks softly to the boxes, a habit born from reverence, telling them that people still care, that justice remains in pursuit. The cords, shells, photographs, and clothing rest in darkness, yet their silent testimony persists. She sometimes imagines the stockroom, picturing warm light falling on shelves, the air tasting of beer and fryer oil, reminding herself why preservation matters. Her logbooks contain neat handwriting, each entry a promise that time will not erode the path to truth. The night siege of 1981 remains an unfinished chord, resonating through courthouse halls, family kitchens, and the quiet corners of archives. Measurement has pared away myth, yet an unanswered question still glows like the bar's neon clock captured in police photographs. Neighbours sometimes pause during evening walks, pressing gloved palms against the brick as if listening for the building's heartbeat. The killer's name hovers just beyond certainty, perhaps already whispered by those who fear reopening old wounds, perhaps waiting within DNA that has yet to bloom into a match. In the evenings, when snow falls thick over Seneca County, the former tavern's bricks hold the day's warmth, exhaling faint scents of dust, cedar, and memories too human to forget. Lantern murals, soundscapes, oral histories, and forensic ledgers all form a vigil that neither shouts nor sleeps. The community continues to listen to the hum of refrigerators, to the rustle of records, to the silence that respects grief while inviting truth. Somewhere between the 36.8 grain slug and the peppermint-tinted cigarette filter lies the final fragment needed to complete the story. Until it surfaces, the town breathes with patience, letting the mystery stay open enough to honor both absence and possibility.